Thank you so much, and thank you to the committee for inviting me here to speak to you. Just one point of clarification, I'm not a doctor, so I wish I could just acquire that credential. But so I'm going to talk to you today about some of the regulatory framework for compounded drugs versus FDA-approved drugs. And my goal here today is not necessarily to provide a comprehensive review or overview of the compounding landscape, the approved drug landscape, or the differences, or even how compounded drugs are regulated with great specificity. What my goal here today is to show you some of the places where when you don't go through the FDA approval process, like compounded drugs don't, there's a greater risk to patients by virtue of simply not going through that process and not being able to take advantage of the FDA review and scrutiny that goes into an application. So with that stage set, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on compounding, and I think a lot of this will be familiar to you all, I think, from a previous presentation. But FDA feels very strongly that compounding can be quite important to patients whose medical needs cannot be met by FDA-approved drug products. And people are certainly out there that need these products. For example, someone has an allergy to an ingredient in an FDA-approved drug. It would be very difficult to try to extract that allergen from the approved drug, or otherwise, manipulate the approved drug in a way that the patient could tolerate it. So people often take a bulk drug substance, an API, active pharmaceutical ingredient, and compound the drug without that ingredient. A situation in which you can often compound using the approved drug itself is if a patient can't swallow a tablet, for example, a pediatric patient, an elderly patient, and needs an FDA-approved drug product, but in a liquid form. I don't know, I'm losing my voice all of a sudden. The key takeaway here, though, is that although compounded drugs can be very important for certain patients, they don't go through the FDA approval process. There's no pre-market review for safety, effectiveness, or manufacturing quality before they're marketed, or at all usually. And for that reason, they inherently present a greater risk to patients than FDA-approved drug products. And unfortunately, that theory has manifested in concrete injuries and deaths. I think many are familiar with the 2012 fungal meningitis outbreak, but there have been many before and since then. And I'm going to talk today about some of those issues associated with the lack of pre-market approval, which I'll explain more in a minute. So, compounding provisions of the law. As a starting place, every new drug generally is required to go through the FDA approval process before it can be marketed, before it can be sent to interstate commerce. Congress carved out from that requirement compounded drug products, provided they meet certain conditions. Section 503A was added to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1997, and it describes the conditions under which a drug product compounded by a licensed pharmacist in a state-licensed pharmacy or federal facility or licensed physician can qualify for certain exemptions. And if a drug compounded by those entities qualifies for all of the, meets all the conditions described in Section 503A, it's exempt from FDA approval requirements, labeling with adequate directions for use, and current good manufacturing practice requirements. And that's CGMP, which is a quality standard that applies typically to most conventionally manufactured drugs that are produced. And there's a number of conditions that have to be met, and all of them have to be met for a drug to qualify for those exemptions. So if certain conditions aren't met, for example, if a pharmacy distributes drugs without receiving a prescription for an individual identified patient, it cannot qualify for these exemptions, and it must go through the approval process, meet CGMP, et cetera. And then 2013, after the 2012 fungal meningitis outbreak, Congress and FDA and others recognized that there was a need for these compounders to sort of fill, I guess, a gap or a void between your traditional state-licensed pharmacy doing patient-specific compounding and your conventional manufacturers, Pfizer, Merck, et cetera. Hospitals often need compounded drugs to maintain on hand in the event that a patient comes in with an emergent need to receive them, and there isn't time to write a prescription, go out and get it, and come back for administration. And so for that and other reasons, in 2013, Congress enacted the Drug Quality and Security Act, and it created a new type of compounder called an outsourcing facility. And outsourcing facilities that meet all of the conditions described in Section 503B of our Act, their drugs can qualify for exemptions from 3 statutory requirements. Like 503A, one of the exemptions is from FDA approval requirements. Also, like 503A, one of the exemptions is labeling with adequate directions for use. And there is no exemption for GMP requirements, current good manufacturing practice requirements. Outsourcing facilities are required to comply with them. There's also an exemption from the Drug Supply Chain Security Act requirements. That was Title II of the law that created the outsourcing facilities. So one of the key differences here, I mentioned patient-specific prescriptions in 503A. There is no such requirement in 503B. And again, that's so that outsourcing facilities can meet the need that was identified for quote-unquote outsourced drug products in hospitals and clinics and other healthcare facilities without a patient in mind at the time that the facility receives the drug. Outsourcing facilities, because they don't have that limitation as well as certain others, often engage in larger scale distribution, send their drugs, to many states. And it's particularly for that reason that it's important that they comply with CGMP, the higher quality standards. So those are sort of how the two, very high level, how the two statutory provisions concerning compounding work together. But I just want to emphasize that if any one of the conditions described in either of those sections is not met, full FD&C Act, new drug approval, GMP, et cetera, apply. I'll also emphasize that there's exemptions from 3 provisions. The rest of the Act applies to your 503A compounders, your 503B compounders. It's only those provisions described in those sections for which there's an exemption. So compounders under 503A, there are, many compounders. We think in the thousands, although, and there's, various estimates that are out there about how many, but they don't register with FDA typically, so we have no way of getting sort of an accurate count of how many are out there. Most are state licensed pharmacies, many are federal facilities. Over the recent years, we've there have been discussions about the fact that physicians are often compounding, although the medical boards typically, we understand, don't do any oversight related to compounding specifically. Pharmacies, and Greg will discuss this, I'm sure, are primarily overseen by the states, but FDA certainly has authority to do inspections when we certainly do when we need to. The frequency and depth of state oversight varies. We have meetings with our state partners every year, usually around September, October, and we one of the things we talk about is oversight and what the states are doing, what we're doing, and some states have really I'll say frequent and comprehensive inspection programs. Other states simply don't have the resources to do that, so it varies. And I mentioned physicians. Outsourcing facilities, again, these are the category that was created in the Drug Quality and Security Act in 2013. And our act actually defines an outsourcing facility. It has to engage in the compounding of sterile drugs, although it can also do non-sterile drugs, and many do engage in non-sterile drug compounding. Has to elect to register as an outsourcing facility. So the decision to become an outsourcing facility is voluntary. But once someone decides to do that, has to register with us. I can't act as an outsourcing facility without registering with FDA. It has to comply with all of the conditions of Section 503B, as I mentioned. It is not required to be a licensed pharmacy, but there must be a licensed pharmacist, and the compounding must be under the direct supervision of the licensed pharmacist. And I don't have the number with me, but we do have a number of outsourcing facilities that are not state licensed pharmacies. We also have a number that are both, so it varies. And as I mentioned, they do not have to obtain patient-specific prescriptions, which is a big, I think, incentive for entities to decide to register with FDA and comply with the higher quality standard and, be subject to risk-based inspections and all of that. There's approximately 70 right now. We always say approximately because sometimes someone new registers, someone decides they don't want to be an outsourcing facility anymore, so it fluctuates, and they can do that, throughout the year when they want to. And if someone who's an outsourcing facility decides not to be an outsourcing facility anymore, then they have to meet all the conditions of 503A to qualify for the exemptions in that section, including getting patient-specific prescriptions. So compounded drugs are not FDA approved, and this is really what I wanted to focus on today. What is sort of missing when a compounded drug is produced and doesn't go through the approval process? So just a few key requirements for approved drugs, just to show the comparison. Manufacturers, package distributors of conventionally manufactured drugs, including approved drugs, register with FDA so we know who they are. They list their drugs with FDA, and so we know what drugs they're making or planning to make or might make. They undergo pre-market review of the drugs for safety, effectiveness, and quality. And we scrutinize the application, the data that's submitted to us, in the context of its proposed indications. When we do that, we look to ensure that there are appropriate warnings, there's adequate directions for use that are appropriately labeled. The drug and actually the bulk drug substance that's used to manufacture the approved drug are produced in a facility that's subject to pre-market inspection, which often includes a site inspection to make sure that the procedures, controls, training, all of these things are adequate to produce a drug that meets appropriate standards for safety and effectiveness and quality. And I mentioned, the facility actually makes the active ingredient is subject to a similar review. All of that is included in the application, so we know where every aspect is coming from. After the fact, we do post-market inspections on a risk-based schedule, and that's where the registration listing comes in. It automatically populates, so we know the universe of entities out there, and we have certain criteria to do a risk-based inspection of those entities. There's also specific adverse event reporting requirements, field alert reporting requirements. Field reports are, quality issues. If there's for example, sterility failure of a drug that's been distributed, there's a reporting obligation. So these are at very high level, key requirements that are just so critical to FDA-approved drugs. I think sometimes they're so fundamental that we sort of forget about them because we're also used to this being the process. This is what happens when we go through approval when someone brings a drug to market. And obviously, this is a very truncated list, but just some key issues. Compounded drugs, on the other hand, really none of that happens. There's no pre-market inspection requirement before the compounder can begin producing and distributing. So with the 503As, we typically don't know who they are, so we wouldn't even begin to be able to say, okay, we want to go here first. With the outsourcing facilities, they register with us, but there's nothing in the law that says that we can tell them you're not allowed to start until we do an inspection. So often they register with us after they're already operating, or they register with us and then start producing. But we can't, unless there's obviously a violation of our act and we want to go to court or bring an injunction or whatever, we can't say, okay, you registered, but you have to wait to begin manufacturing until we go into your facility. So that's a key difference. There's no pre-market review of the quality standards, specifications, controls for compounding, including the use of bulk drug substances. And so, even a lot of people say, well, outsourcing facilities have to comply with GMPs. Isn't that enough? Well, outsourcing facilities will create their specifications and test their drugs to see if they meet those specifications, but there's no pre-market review to ensure that those specifications are based on data, based on trials, et cetera, and that those specifications are themselves accurate. And then the 503As, of course, don't comply with GMPs or aren't required to comply with GMPs and typically don't. Same thing with the manufacturer of the bulk drug substance. So in terms of post-marketing inspections, again, we don't know who most of the 503A pharmacies, physicians are out there, and so we don't inspect many of them. We do three types of inspections. We do limited surveillance inspections, very limited, and only of entities that we have come across over the years that we know about. And so we'll do a certain percentage of those a year, but not as compared to the thousands that are out there, maybe it kind of varies year to year, but no more than, probably 70. Don't quote me on that number, but it's, or less even, it depends. But we don't do many surveillance inspections. We do for-cause inspections when we get a complaint, an adverse event, something along those lines. Someone says, hey, I injected something and I have an infection now or whatever. That might trigger us to do an inspection to see if there's any, contamination issues or whatever else. So often states ask us to, with assistance, that they think there might be violations of federal law and they refer them to us. So we receive complaints from a number of different ways, and that might trigger a for-cause inspection. And then a follow-up inspection is last if we do a regulatory action. So I think my time is up, but I do want you to see the next slide. So I'm going to flip to this if I just have 20 more seconds. This is sort of a summary of what's missing when we don't go through the approval process, and each of these bullets corresponds to what we call risk alerts on our website, where there have been adverse events not necessarily associated to contamination or poor quality standards that we often hear about, but actually the fact that something didn't go through the pre-market approval process, so we weren't able to review labeling that omitted certain warnings that resulted in a death, or there was a formulation problem that something contained too much active ingredient, many people went blind. So things along those lines, and I encourage you to look at our website to take a look at those.